Hello, welcome back to another exciting edition of Meet the Solutionaries on greentv.com, where we tell the truth, science-based facts about not only climate change, but all of our environmental challenges. And I'm really pleased to have on someone who has just recently come to my attention. His name is Gerald Kutney. He is a Canadian. He is an author. He is quite accomplished. I'm going to read just a few of the things that you have here in your bio. You commentate a lot on mainstream media, but also social media. You're big on Twitter. That's how I found you. My colleague, give credit where credit is due, Chris Weiss, said, you've got to talk to this guy, so I can't wait. You are very obsessed with the politics of climate change, so I know we're going to get along on that. There shouldn't be politics of climate change, right? But somehow that happened. You've written a couple of books, Carbon Politics and the Failure of the Kyoto Protocol, or I guess that's one book with a long title. And the one you're working on now is called ClimateBrawl versus Climate Denial, the Politics of the Climate Crisis. And I hear you've made the hashtag ClimateBrawl well known. So I guess that's a good place to jump in. By the way, did I say you're from Ottawa?
That's correct.
Yeah. Where did you come up with that term, ClimateBrawl? And how long have you been at this ClimateBrawl thing?
Well, it's an interesting story. I've been active on Twitter against climate denialism literally for a decade. And when I first started out, it was like what everyone else was doing. Climate deniers would put up some propaganda and I show them a link to NASA or the IPCC saying, well, this is what the science really says. But it wasn't very effective. They just go on and give you something else and something else. It just goes on forever. And that's what they're looking for. I remember this one interaction. It was with a very high profile climate denier, very well-known person. He's a cartoonist. And it was a long weekend and I started in with them. And he didn't do very much, but he had all these hundreds of followers. And I was overwhelmed. They just came at me from right and left and with one tweet after another.
Mostly right, mostly from the right.
Yeah, and it was exhausting. I knew there are other people on Twitter that would want to help, but I had no way of contacting them. You know, Twitter doesn't lend itself to that. And that was around 2018. And I kept on it for a while. And then in 2019, I was saying, well, this is going to be a bit much. I'm going to try something different. So I said, why not put out a hashtag? Never did a hashtag before, and that hashtag was ClimateBrawl. The whole purpose of ClimateBrawl, it was meant to be sort of like a bat signal. You know, you shine it in the Twitterverse and saying, hey, I'm a climate activist. I'm in this mess with all these climate deniers and their followers. I could use some help. I had no idea if anyone would even pay attention. Well, I was pleasantly surprised. It developed a life of its own. And now people use it all the time on Twitter, and it's worked really well. We have hundreds, if not thousands of members on Twitter. And it's everybody all over the place. You don't have to be a scientist to be a member of ClimateBrawl. And most of the climate deniers have known nothing about science to begin with.
No, that's the irony, tragic irony. So the cavalry came.
Cavalry came, and it's morphed into more of a community that we often work together. And now instead of one of us being overwhelmed by a horde of climate deniers, usually it's the other way around now. Well, I really feel we made a major difference on Twitter. The climate denialism that we see on Twitter is quite different. And now they're often on the defensive and nobody wants to argue with us. It's a nice position to be. And most of them have become much more quieter than they used to be before.
You notice that? I did too. Maybe it's because it's undeniable as it was back then, but it's especially undeniable thanks to the extreme weather and all the other impacts we're seeing if you just open your eyes.
Exactly.
I love the fact that you're a big social media influencer and you're not 20 or less.
Well, I'm not too far off, but I'm...
How does that feel to be someone of influence with, and what's your background before you became a climate brawler?
Well, going way back, I have a PhD in chemistry. I generally worked in the forest bioeconomy. Later on, I guess when again, about a decade or so, I started becoming more interested in climate change and climate activism. Until that, I was not an activist when I was younger about anything. Yeah, but a few years ago in 2019, in the fall, my wife and I went on the climate march what a lot of people did around the world, led by Greta Thunberg. First time I had ever been in an activist march in my life. And so why did I get onto Twitter? Well, a lot of people like my age, it's because my son convinced me it was something I should do. And he's actually been a lot of help. When I first went on Twitter, as was mentioned before, I used to show papers from the IPCC about the latest climate science and stuff like that. And that was nice and people liked it, but didn't cause much of a stir. So my son kept on telling me, well, tell him what you think. And I said, what? He said, well, tell him what you think. I said, nobody's going to be interested in what I think. But he kept on begging me and bugging me and bugging me. And I said, okay, I'll give it a try. So I just tweet, away I go in some blurby tweet. And lo and behold, I soon found out people want to chat on Twitter about stuff like this. And so where before I might get several likes, I was now getting tens of likes on my tweets as went on. And so that's how it really got started. And I didn't set out to be an activist or anything else. It just evolved with time. And I really developed a life of its own.
And there's so much to say about the climate, given the urgency, given, you know, the denialism has gone to diminishment, delayism, all those D words. But we have lost so much precious time. Well,
that's why I really got into it, as far as being an obsession with me. Time is against us. And all climate denialism, this science has been solid for 3 decades. You know, this argument over the science is literally a joke. And so we've lost so much time, and every second we waste, it's going to be that much harder as we go along. So you've nailed it. Time is everything when it comes to climate change. We have to get going.
And the thing that really kills me, and it pains me physically, and maybe you can relate to this, if we didn't have denialism, and we never should have, if we didn't have the fossil fuel industry, you know, funding denial or confusion, I guess you could say for sure, it still is such a ginormous, epic challenge what we have ahead of us. And it would have been a little less ginormous 10, 20, 30 years ago. But we have now kicked the carbon can down the road so long that it is so daunting. And that's those forces, those dark forces that would have us delay until it really is too late. And we're getting dangerously close to that, scientists say. That's what's so maddening, right? Like, we have this is just, it's not funny, it's not reversible, it's not anything that should be tolerated.
Well, your point is very well taken. As far as the science was concerned, the major transition when the science was wrapping up enough information that action should be taken was during the 1980s. By the end of the Reagan administration, the world was ready to take action on climate change because the science was ready. And the proof of that is in 1992 at the Rio conference, the UNFCCC was formed. And that's where the world agreed that the science was good enough that we had to start taking action on it.
And then, yeah.
I was just going to say, it was the propaganda campaigns launched by the oil industries, which was just disgusting what happened, that they hired the best PR firms in the world. A lot of the people that had been in the tobacco propaganda campaigns against smoking and cancer had joined in. And that's the reason why we didn't take action in the 1990s. And we're still fighting this campaign now.
And in 1988, of course, Dr. James Hansen testified, and many people thought that would be the beginning of the wake up. I know Al Gore did, he said he did in his films, and it should have been a NASA scientist. And now we have another NASA scientist. You must follow Peter Kulmus.
Oh, Peter's a real treat. He is bearing his soul on this issue more than probably any other climate scientist is. I have a lot of climate scientists that I consider to be heroes. People like Michael Mann and Catherine Hayhoe. And Peter has become one of them. And I just love how he really, as I said, he bears his soul, how important this issue is to him as a person. And he has the backing of being a climate scientist as well. And so climate denialism is fairly active in Canada, but again, on a much smaller scale. And a lot of it is almost an overflow from the US.
We're spilling over, we're so big with our denial, and then some other ills.
We have a major oil industry, and especially in Alberta. It's very important to the province, and a lot of the oil majors are there. And, there aren't US oil majors, not Canadian oil majors. They're all global oil majors these days. And they often follow the same sort of path. The Canadian ones are generally more quiet. But when when shove comes to push or push comes to shove, they are not scared of pushing back. I think they're more progressive than what we see in the US, but not a lot more progressive.
What's with Justin Trudeau? He's kind of a hard guy to read when it comes to climate and the environment.
Talking politics, of course, with anybody at any time is always a hard one. The Conservative Party in Canada actually voted down to accept that climate change was a crisis issue, was an emergency. And so they wouldn't even put it on their platform. And so right away, for us people that are concerned about climate activism, that really put them out. The Liberals are the other major parties that have held federal office. Certainly they have done things that a lot of people feel they should have done much more. I am one of them. We do have a price on carbon in Canada, which is an achievement in its own right. It's not trivial. There is a huge political cost to that, as the Conservatives and the right just milk that for everything it is worth, about how horrible that the Liberals are taxing the poor, and that look at the price of gasoline today. It's all because of the price on carbon.
Oh, it's all President Biden's fault, because he can just wave a magic wand and make the prices go down. It's so ridiculous. It's so childish.
Exactly. And just put in perspective, in Canada, for example, our gas is per liter. Now it's over $2 per liter. It wasn't that long ago, over a year, it was like $1 per liter. The so-called price on carbon, the total amount that's in there right now is 11 cents per liter. So I'm not saying that's trivial, but compared to a literally over 100% increase in cost, which has been led by the fossil fuel industry, has nothing to do with the price on carbon. Of course, you don't have that in the US, and you have the same horrible increases in gasoline prices.
And as we're speaking, the fossil fuel industry, the companies are getting subsidized, which makes all of our efforts probably just pale in comparison. How do you deal with that kind of, I don't know, sometimes I just feel like, what's the point? Why am I devoting most of my life to this when the odds are so stacked against not us, the activists, but us who would fight for a livable planet?
On a generic note, when you're talking with the politicians, whether in Canada or the US, both of us are major fossil fuel producers. These people want to get reelected. They'll push the envelope somewhat, but there's only so far they can push. When you have a major industry and you simply go all in against it, there's a price to pay for that. And so generally a political party won't do that. Some will push harder than others. And again, from an activist side, it's never enough, with good reason. It's not that activists are out to lunch, but there's also a political reality that these people have to try to work in. My own personal opinion is they should be pushing that envelope more, but I do understand this is a scientific, this is a social issue, it's a cultural issue, but part of it is also purely a political issue. And really, as we mentioned earlier on, the reason we have not done more to stopping the climate crisis, it's all political.
And it got politicized. How did that happen? And then why was that allowed to happen? And how can conservatives, who should be conservation minded by dint of their title, their name, get away with this in 2022? You must know what goes on in our Senate. It's ridiculous. It's beyond. Can you believe it? Really? Just take a big step back and go, WTF? Really? What planet do you have reservations on? Where do you think your children and grandkids are going to be going? And by the way, it's always about they want to hold on to their power, these politicians who are so regressive. Who wants to be in power right now? The world is such a mess. It's a thankless job. Just ask Joe Biden, I would imagine, around now. So there's not even a good reason to destroy the planet so you can have the perks,
Well, in my opinion, when I've looked at this, how this really began was during the Reagan administration. After Carter, again, the science was there, But Reagan ingrained small government, non-regulatory, capitalist policies. And so it wasn't on climate change directly. Like Reagan didn't even say much about climate change. He just ignored it most of the time.
It did take that one solar panel off the roof.
Yeah, he tore down
not bode
Jimmy
well. Like,
Carter's
you have
solar
nothing better
panel.
to do than take that one little solar panel down.
Exactly. And there's some interesting quotes he had about those solar panels that we can't repeat on here. But that changed American politics forever.
Yeah.
And so I love this statement by Senator Markey, where he says the GOP is now the gas and oil party. And so in fairness to Republicans, this is no longer a scientific issue. It's an ideological issue. And that's a horrible situation to be in.
Did you say in fairness to Republicans? Are you defending?
What I'm saying is they've abandoned science on this completely. And so there is no science that's going to convince the party to change. And so once this becomes ideology, what are you supposed to do? Well, why did it become ideology, especially in the US so much? Well, this goes back to this massive propaganda campaign by the oil and gas industry. These were some of the most powerful corporations in the world, the most powerful lobbyists in the United States. And they've been at this for 30 years, spending tens of millions of dollars every year of promoting this forward. And now it's become ingrained. And so now if anyone brings up, and it's coming that way in Canada too, it's not quite as bad, but it's getting there. If you bring up climate change, you're a liberal or a communist.
I've been called a
It's the
socialist.
thing
Yep.
I've ever heard of in my life. That's science, but that's what it's become.
It's absurd is what it is. It would be laughable if it wasn't so tragically serious.
Well, that's why I focus so much on climate denialism and their propaganda, because I can't change your ideology. No one's going to change mine. No one's going to change yours. But that ideology has been reinforced constantly by this propaganda. So I do my best, and the Friends of ClimateBrawl do their best as well, of trying to discredit the propaganda and the source of the propaganda. And frankly, it's the only way I know to potentially tackle this as we go forward.
Maybe we should call it idiotology.
That would fit quite well.
Too well.
And the problem is that a lot of these people are highly intelligent.
No, I don't understand that. More than anything, I don't understand that.
I don't either. But you know as well as I do, some of the greatest proponents of climate denialism in politics are certainly highly educated people.
And so their brain is outweighed by their ideology. I mean, like, how does that happen in one person? I can't even imagine.
Well, that's the thing. If it happens to one person, it's okay. The real question is, how did it happen to an entire party, especially in a country like the US, where you only got two to begin with? In Canada, we have a little bit of an excuse because we have like 4 or 5 parties, that we have more of a chance. So if one of them gets screwed up, we have a little bit more options. But geez, you have no choice.
And it spread like a virus. Speaking of COVID, we saw the same anti-science point of view. People refusing to get vaccinated. I know some refusing to wear masks, refusing to believe that it was COVID that was killing them when they were on their deathbed.
Well, it's an infodemic. And that's a fair phrase to describe what's happened with COVID. But the climate change one is literally 100 times worse, in the sense that climate science has been accepted for like 30, 40 years. COVID science is new. It's only been around for a few years. So new things are coming up constantly. There hasn't been a lot of anything to disrupt the science of climate change for decades. It's as solid now, more so than it was in 1980.
And look what we learned from COVID, how quickly behavior could change. Putting a mask on should be simple, much less complex than how we fix climate change. But if we couldn't even get people to wear masks for their own protection, how are we going to get, there's a public impact from private choices and private behaviors. And that's why, I live in Texas now, and these giant, pickup trucks, and you don't have to be in Texas to see gas guzzlers everywhere with one little person in them. Why is that okay when it impacts everybody? And even if it's their kid's asthma sitting in the back seat, such a disconnect.
Well, the sad part, which you've identified, is true for COVID. It's true for creationists. Science has become so politicized. Science is apolitical. It really is. There's no such thing as liberal science and conservative science. There's just science.
Yeah.
And the frustration I always had is, you look when in Congress, when climate change is discussed, they'll often debate whether the science is valid or not. That's all they do in Congress. I look at myself, I said, no politician in the world has the right to determine whether science is valid or not. That's what science does. Politicians have to determine how to react to that science, and they can react as they determine to see fit. That I accept. But please don't have a session where you're saying that, oh, the IPCC reports are wrong, or this science is wrong. And I've looked at literally a couple of hundred congressional sessions dealing with climate change. I don't know the exact percentage, but the vast majority, they're just debating whether the science is valid or not. As long as you're stuck in that, the oil industry has won.
And let's ask for their credentials. Are they a scientist? Are they a climate expert? Do they know anything about the atmosphere? You know, higher degree of education? No, never, but they somehow know more. And whatever profession they're in, when I do meet those deniers, dinosaurs, I say, and what do you do? And would you listen to somebody who was not in your field, your area of expertise? You know, would you take advice from them, or would you listen to your peers who have degrees and education? And I was flying on JetBlue a couple of years ago and learned that pilots tend to not believe in climate change, or so I was told. Now, that one was another disconnect. Like, what? I was sitting on a flight, JetBlue pilot off duty in his uniform, sitting at the window, and I'm a nervous flyer. So I said, you know, can I just ask you a couple of questions about turbulence, so I can maybe just stop being scared by it? And he said, sure. And he explained that the wings are made to kind of go up that high and still the plane will stay flying. And I said, okay. And then I'm sure I brought up what I do, media, climate change. And he quickly let me know that he was not at all concerned about climate change, which of course was my signal to push harder. And I said, what do you mean it's not a concern? Well, it's a natural phenomenon. I said, uh-oh, double signals. And I sat there with my jaw dropped as I heard him say that, no, he doesn't think it's man-made. It's not a problem. It's cyclical. And I thought, oh my gosh, I said, but I couldn't resist. And he was actually trapped because we were on a flight, right? And he was at the window. I said, to explain to me how you fly as if these planes based on science and data, and you rely on that not only for your life, but lives of everybody behind you, but you don't accept climate science. And he didn't want to talk about it. I start getting, you know, I like to push because why not? Somebody's got to speak up. And he didn't want to talk about it at that point. And then I said, well, do you think you're kind of an outlier? Do most pilots, you know, understand climate science? Oh no, I'd say about 80% of pilots don't think it's any big deal, climate science. I said, oh my gosh. That was maybe 5 years ago.
I don't know about the pilot situation. I haven't heard that before. It could very well be true.
Check it out. He confidently said 80%.
The one thing, in fairness to the people that, face it, you and I are into this a lot. Most people are not. But you look in the situation in the US, you were mentioning Fox News before. Fox News keeps on telling all its viewers that climate change is a hoax. The previous president of the United States were telling Americans that climate change is a hoax. There are contrarian scientists. Some of them are highly qualified. Not many of them, but they're very vocal, telling people that it's a hoax.
We wish, if only it was a hoax, right?
and the mass media was a real problem earlier on. It's getting better now than it used to be. You know, this concept of you always show both sides of the story. Well, you're supposed to show both sides of the story when there's two sides to show.
Exactly.
You know, and so in fairness, I can see, especially when people didn't really want to believe it to begin with, because again, their ideological background. And so they would use almost any excuse, but there was so much for them to hear. And that's what's made this so hard. So I don't blame the pilot. I don't blame the engineer. I don't blame the geologist. You know, there's factors why these people have been so turned against the science. The one thing I do know is all the problems that we're discussing today and why the climate crisis is still running out of control and we've done nothing. It has nothing to do with science. And that is so frustrating because so much effort and so much knowledge. Climate change is probably has had the greatest scrutiny of any science in history. And there's been so much effort. The IPCC reports, they're unprecedented.
I know.
We've just gone through our 6th series. There was 34,000 papers reviewed in the last series of IPCC reports. It's mind-boggling.
Consensus. That's a consensus document. So they have to work so hard to make sure everybody is on board. And have you noticed for UN Secretary General Guterres, is trying to invent new words to alarm people. They were more cautious, like 5 years ago. They didn't want to alarm people, or they thought that what they were saying, just giving the facts and figures, which should have been alarming enough to wake people up. And increasingly it's, code red for humanity, delay is death. Where they're pleading with people to pay attention and to take action. And I don't know what more they can say or do at this point. Stand on their heads, stage a hunger strike. I've felt like doing something like that at times because, like you say, you don't blame the pilots and the engineers. I kind of do. It's 2022 and information is at your fingertips. And the problem is by them not believing it, choosing to for their ideology reasons or whatever, it holds everything else back. And what about our unborn grandchildren? Mine aren't born yet. And how sad is that? Do we want to bring young women are not having children because of the environmental situation and climate change in particular? As a mother of one, the most gratifying thing I've ever done, what a thing to rob yourself of. But I'm going to have second thoughts about whether my grandchildren should come to the world, but my daughter won't listen to me anyway, so I can have all the thoughts I want. And of course I want lots of grandchildren. She's my only child, but it's so tinged with sadness. So that's where I get angry at those people, because if it was just impacting their lives or their family, even their little community, one thing, but it holds everything back.
I'm glad
we vote for it.
I'm glad you brought up Guterres, because Secretary Generals of the UN have generally been supportive. He is an activist. And actually, I've been pleasantly surprised about how aggressive he is and how aggressive he is against fossil fuels. Increasingly
so, like every report that comes out,
he's really a special person on the world stage. Well,
and he's not exaggerating. He's just telling it like it is.
Oh yeah, and he's just showing his frustration, just like we are right now. He feels this. This is not some mission of him. He believes this is super important. And as being head of the United Nations, he does have to be a little bit careful what he says. And so he is still being aggressive. If more politicians were like him, we'd be so much better off.
I could hear. I completely agree. I just want to go back to one thing about Canada. I remember, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, give or take, there was an ad on television. I almost jumped through my TV, which happens a lot, feeling like I'm going to pounce, but can't really do that, about tar sands, how they were no more dangerous, or I don't even think they use the word carbon, in the American Petroleum Institute fossil fuel ads, that tar sands were just fine, just like regular oil. And knowing what I know about the Alberta tar sands, I just thought, oh my God. Now that spot didn't last too long. Maybe it was on for 6 months, and I imagine it went away because some people who know more, said you can't say that, it's an outright lie. What is happening with tar sands in Alberta now?
If you look at Canadian GHG emissions, they're very high for a smallish country. On a per capita basis, we're right up there near the top. Wow. I think we're number 2 or number 3. And people make, well, we're a big country, you have to have a gas guzzler to drive across to Canada, blah, blah, blah. It's cold up here. But the major reason that we are so high is because of the oil sands in Alberta. And what has happened is that since ever, our emissions have been increasing like crazy. Most of Canada, they went down. In Quebec, they went down. In Ontario, they went down over the last 10 years. In BC, they went down over the last 10 years. And in Alberta, they almost doubled. And that's because of the production of the oil sands. If you're just looking at greenhouse gas emissions, GHG emissions, the big detriment of the oil sands compared to traditional oil is it takes a huge amount of energy to process the oil sands. And so compared to sweet crude, our emissions per barrel are way higher. And it's not because we are doing something wrong, it's the nature of the beast. Sweet crude, you don't have to do much with. It's a beautiful oil, it's easy to process. And so in Canada, we're literally mining a lot of this stuff. We're using steam to get it out of the ground. And so it is the reason why Canada is doing so poorly on the global scale of handling its greenhouse gas emissions.
So you would be third after us in China, I would imagine, for per capita.
Well, per capita, China is not that high per capita. China's pretty low. You have a few of these Gulf states that are very high. I think Canada on a per capita basis is even slightly higher than the US. And again, because you have some shale sands or shale oil down there, but it's nothing compared to the huge amount of oil that we're producing up here.
That's right. China has the overall highest amount of greenhouse gas emissions, but that's not per capita. They have so many people there and they have so much industry and make so many of the things that we wear, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So if you were Prime Minister, Gerald, what would you do, knowing the urgency, being frustrated with the obstacles and almost all of them, well, the unnecessary obstacles, the politicizing, right? As opposed to just the physical obstacles. What do you think we should do to get off fossil fuels fast? And is that even feasible given the state of renewable energy right now?
I'm certainly not an expert to be a politician, because I mentioned that there are restrictions that politicians have to work under, or there can be very severe consequences, more than just being reelected. But let's forget about that for a minute. And then just for example, Alberta threatens, well, if you're going to treat me like this, I'm going to, I don't want to be part of Canada anymore.
We keep wanting to come to Canada if Trump gets elected again. Yeah. I think this time people are really going to leave.
Don't get me started on that one. But first of all, is the science of the IPCC is the starting point. It's accepted. There's no more debate. I do believe that this has to be a bipartisan issue, but you have to accept some basic ground rules to be allowed in the room. And those ground rules are essentially set by the science. And the IPCC is just as good as anything else you can get out there. And so in Canada, the oil sands have to be phased out. There's no choice but that. That's a very difficult decision because it's like, I forget what it is, 10% of the Canadian GDP. There's thousands upon thousands of people that are in that. At the same time, I believe in the policy, you leave nobody is left behind. And what that means, if the Canadian government decides to shut down the oil sands industry, every single employee is protected. Now, that is not meaning a retraining program, I mean financially protected. There's no way a government should be allowed to go in and say, I'm going to shut down an industry, and 50,000 people have to be retrained to try to find new work. Because I can tell you, if you're in your 50s, the odds of you finding much work out of that in the new industry is pretty small.
As a coder, yeah.
Yeah, as a coder, which they often say. So that goes with it. So there's a huge expense with that. Going EV is a great way. Most countries are doing that, 2030, 2035 in Europe, it's a great advantage. But that EV is only important if we have low carbon GHG emissions energy sources.
Right.
And
we don't yet.
and we're lucky in Ontario and in Quebec, for example, and BC, we got large hydro plants. The issue is what comes up is nuclear. Okay, which more from the left side, well, that's verboten, and if on the right side, they love it.
I know they love it. Like what about nuclear is so lovable, but it's so predictable. If they're going to say anything, okay, nuclear.
My feeling there is, like I said, it's got to be somewhat bipartisan. I don't think I'm going to dictate what sort of sources should be used. Everything should be on the table. And what may be good for what's good in the West Coast may not be good for the prairies or the East Coast, certainly from among countries as well. But all sides have to be willing to be fair in this and listen to the science and not their emotions. And so when you're talking, and you also can't have two priorities. That's always a tough one to handle, because you can't say, oh, well, I don't want to use nuclear because of this. Forget about what this is, okay? And I'm not arguing there's not baggage that goes with nuclear. I'm saying, is nuclear an option for handling GHG emissions? Yes, and I'm not saying it's a good one, it may be the worst one. But the idea is to move forward and get something done. We've been discussing this on high-level politics for over 30 years in both countries. We haven't done a very good job at it so far. We've got so far to go in such a short period of time. Something has to be pushed out of the way to get this going.
Well, Gerald, I would like to join your climate brawl. I like everything you've said.
You're very welcome to join.
Would love to. And I don't find you so radical. I was expecting, like, burn the house down or something. You just say it with a lot of clarity. And you obviously have a scientific background, and you're an influencer who's got gray hair. So cool. Good for you.
Thank you.
I have gray hair underneath, but I'm not quite an influencer yet. And along those lines, we want to just ask if maybe you could mention Green TV in this interview for your many followers, because we have plans to grow quickly, to grow largely, because the mainstream media is just not covering this day in and day out. And it's not just this, it's not just one issue. It's the ecosystems are in collapse, and the web of life is, falling apart, so it seems. So we think that 24/7 would be a good amount of time to cover our planetary pickle. So that's where Green TV is going, but we need a lot more viewers, and we promise we'll bring the most interesting and knowledgeable and passionate people that we can find. That's what I've been doing all these years, because I think the experts should be connected to the public. That's the missing piece, we do believe. So we want to be a communications bridge. Thanks for that little plug for Green TV. But if we're interviewing all these great people like you, Gerald, but nobody knows about us, then it's a waste of time, and I hate waste, and I don't want to waste your time either. So we're getting there. We got hundreds of viewers, but we need thousands, and then we need millions. So, the sooner we can get more, the sooner we can live stream, the sooner we can get some funding, the sooner we can have not just the Betsy Rosenberg show, but even more topics and hosts and talent on Green TV. So thanks for letting me say that, because you have a lot of followers, so we could use some of them. And I think they would like Green TV because we have people like you on.
Oh, thank you so much. And it'd be my pleasure to promote it. Just a small plug in Canada. News media generally don't do a lot about climate change, even so-called more left-wing media. The Guardian is probably the most famous newspaper in the world. In Canada, we have the Canadian National Observer, and they do more on climate change almost as anybody. And so it helps. I don't know in the US if you have anyone like that. It'd be better if you did.
Well, the newspapers have gotten better, certainly the Washington Post, the New York Times, but it's taken a long time. I've been at this long enough. I remember when they shut down their environmental desk at the New York Times, and then someone woke up, had an eco epiphany, and said, "Oh, we should do climate, make it a regular beat," and now they're on it. But all those years, those precious years, were lost.
Well, Washington Post is a very good one, by the way, because they also go on the limb a little bit more than some of the more standard press usually does as well, and that's appreciated.
And we need solutions. And I know that journalists, publishers of newspapers have said they don't believe it's their job, their role, to offer the public solutions. And they say that's up to Greenpeace or the Sierra Club. I said, well, that's fine. They'll reach their members with great newsletters and information, but those are not the people we most need to reach, right? What about everybody else? So that's what our focus is here on Solutionaries. Thank you for being one of them. And I like to remember to ask my guests at the end of each interview, what would you like to see our viewers do? What advice would you give so they can help be part of the solution?
When you look about individuals to do something about climate change, there's three things. There's act. That means do something yourself to reduce your own greenhouse gas emissions. Doesn't matter what it is, just do something. Number two is engage. Be an activist, promote it, talk to other people about it. Don't be scared to talk to your uncle who doesn't believe in climate change. You were mentioning the pilot. Talk to people about it.
I do.
And the most important thing of all, it all resides with politicians. And so vote. Never vote for a climate denier. You have to decide, and this is hard. I've become a one-issue voter. That's a horrible thing to have to do. I realize that that's not the way it's supposed to be, but that's what voting is. Everything in this. When the Republicans get back in, which unfortunately that will happen sometime, it's going to set things back again a long period of time. So keep in the back of your mind the long-term consequences of what your vote means. It's the most important, powerful thing you have.
And the climate window to act is closing. And we've been saying that for a few years, and it's closing faster. We can ill afford another administration that is actively blocking progress. I mean, it really should be a crime. I think it should be required for anybody who runs for any office at any level to say, yes, sign on the dotted line. I believe in science. I think that they know what they're talking about. I will follow their advice, or don't run, stay home.
You're talking to the converted.
I know, and we need to grow the choir. So thanks for all you're doing on that front.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thanks for inviting me here today.
Wonderful. Let's stay in touch. I'll follow you. Your Climate Brawl, and I'm a woman on e-mission.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gerald. Have a great green weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.